It must have been during our Christmas break. An old friend of mine was having a party, and there was going to be alcohol and drugs. Of course, I was going to be there. This friend lived in a town a few miles away, and I was dropped off there with some other folks, expecting to stay the whole night. However, later on, I decided I really just wanted to sleep in my bed. At this point, it was really late at night, and everyone else was already pretty intoxicated. I knew the only way for me to get home would be to walk. I knew at the time it would be a long walk. I looked up the exact distance for the sake of this story. It was about 3 miles from his house back to mine, but I was pretty buzzed and motivated to be somewhere comfortable. I had my Zune with me, so I decided to go for it. Additionally, it was December in central New York, so there was a steady snowstorm that night. One important thing you should know is that when I was in high school, I was a big fella. I was about 5 feet 11 and weighed around 330 pounds at the time, so I was quite hefty. I also didn't care too much about staying clean-shaven, so I had a beard vaguely similar to Fidel Castro, and actually dressed like him for Halloween a few years later, so I'm being quite literal here. I also always wore basketball shorts no matter what the weather was like. Part of that was just my preference for comfort, and the other part was my high tolerance for cold weather. It just didn't bother me that much. So I get about a mile into my walk, and at this point, it must have been nearly 3 in the morning when this woman, in her early 30s perhaps and driving by herself, pulls up alongside me. She claimed to be concerned, which honestly I can understand. I must have looked kind of unusual at that moment. She insisted over and over again that I let her give me a ride. I didn't want a ride. I was fine in the cold with my music, and I was actually enjoying the walk. I told her I was okay, but she absolutely refused to take no for an answer. That's when I started feeling uncomfortable in this situation. Even though I was young at the time, I understood how I looked as a big guy with a big beard and a rugged demeanor, walking down a county highway in the middle of the night. I probably looked exactly like the kind of person you're taught to avoid, but she wouldn't leave me alone. The way she kept insisting I get in her car just felt menacing. The issue for me, however, was that even on this 40 miles per hour speed limit stretch, this woman decided that she would just follow me, slightly behind me, driving at my walking pace. Every so often she would pull up next to me and offer, once again, a ride home. At one point, I got fed up with it and decided I'd just accept the ride, but as I approached the car, she told me that I couldn't sit in the front. I had to go in the back seat. Immediately, I found that bizarre. If this woman was genuinely concerned and willing to pick up a stranger as unusual looking as me in the middle of the night, what was the significance of me sitting in the back seat? I began envisioning child safety locks and the possibility of being kidnapped inexplicably by a woman I outweighed by probably 200 pounds. I decided not to get in the car after all. She didn't seem entirely happy with that and called the police. Some cops showed up, and she tried to convince them that I needed a ride home. The cops determined I was old enough to make that decision on my own, and also probably realized how bizarre it was for a total stranger to be making such a demand. So they left me to it. Interestingly, the police officer didn't offer me a ride either, which I would have accepted willingly just to get away from this lady. Nothing much else interesting happened except for the fact that, according to my Google Maps calculations, this woman followed me for almost 40 minutes on my walk home. By the time I was close to my house, I was so unnerved by her that I cut through a few yards and went to my friend's place, where there was an open-door policy, to wait for another hour or so until I was sure she was gone. There's just a lot about this experience that doesn't make sense to me. Why would a woman, all alone in the middle of the night, decide that she absolutely needed to get me? A big, scruffy-looking guy in her car, but only in the back seat? Where was she going at almost 3 in the morning that she could take a nearly hour-long detour just to follow me home? Why did she get the cops involved to literally try to make me accept her offer? None of it seemed normal to me, and in the moment, it was genuinely terrifying. I live in a foreign country, and I don't know about your country's sanitary measures against the epidemic, but at that time we were no longer confined. It happened in September of this year. I was driving from my parents' house to a friend's apartment near our college campus. It was an hour-and-a-half drive there. We had plans to spend the week together after not seeing each other for months. Even though the incident is not related to my friends in any way, it just hit me how dangerous it actually was when I started telling them what had happened. I remember one of them saying, "This must have been the worst 45-minute drive of my life." I laughed at it back then, but it hits me now how true it was. I left quite late that day, around 9 p.m. because I remember the sun had already set, and I was going to arrive late, which I didn't like. But I was used to the road, as I had often taken it. For some context, it was an hour-and-a-half drive, and I would usually stop midway in a McDonald's parking lot to smoke a cigarette before carrying on. I saw the hitchhiker not long after I left my parents' house. I had driven about for 15 minutes or so when I saw him at the exit of a roundabout. It was a tall, slender guy with one of those tiny shoulder bags guys wear across the chest. I thought it was a guy in his 20s who had just been dropped off by his friends on his way back from a party or something, which was stupid because it was still too early for a party to end, but that's the first thought I had, and I immediately felt sympathy and stopped. I opened the passenger window and asked where he was going. I realized right away that he was way older than I thought, at least in his 30s. He had a really pale face, and the way he looked at me honestly freaked me out. The guy was going in my direction, to the town where I would stop midway to take a break. I don't know what I was thinking, to be honest. I just responded automatically that it was on my way, and he opened the door. And I had the worst next 45 minutes of my life. I don't mean to be dramatic, but it really was hell. I knew right away I had made a mistake as I drove off, because as soon as I started driving, he held his stomach tight, crouched himself in the passenger seat, doing back and forth, saying he wasn't feeling good. I offered to open the windows for some fresh air, but he said he just had to take his meds, which he didn't. Saying I felt uncomfortable is an understatement. I remember thinking I had screwed up and that whatever happened, I should not stop under any circumstances. The first thing I did was ask him if he would be okay if I dropped him off at that city's McDonald's. It had a well-lit parking lot. There were always people there until midnight, and I could leave immediately onto a fast road. I think he agreed, but either way, it didn't matter because I wasn't planning on stopping elsewhere. I was already freaked out, though I pretended to focus on the road and tried to appear as calm as I could. He kept talking during this whole time. I don't remember in what order it happened exactly, but I remember he asked me if he could look at my nails, to which I responded that I was driving. He apologized, said I shouldn't worry because he had never assaulted anyone. He told me his girlfriend was mad at him, wanted to break up with him if he didn't come back. He asked where I was going, what I was planning to do tonight, if I was planning to have a long steaming bath, if I had a boyfriend, how we liked to do it. I said that was private and that I did not want to answer. He nodded, said he used to be young too until he got arrested. This is not a typo. Young until arrested were his words. He insisted twice that we were followed by cars. Asked me if I smoked weed. I said no. He offered me a cigarette. I said that was nice, but he didn't have to. He left a cigarette on the dashboard. He took out his phone at one point and wanted to show me a picture of him and a picture of his mom, saying she was beautiful. I took a quick glimpse, and the freaking thing was broken, like it had multiple straight black lines of broken pixels, and it was reddish on the left and yellowish on the right, which made the picture really creepy. He got mad at that point because I was just taking a quick glimpse, and he started talking louder, saying I didn't give a fuck about what he was saying. I straight up said, I am listening, I can't watch, I am driving. He calmed down immediately, said, okay, sorry, and wanted to show me another picture. He asked if it was my car. I said it was my parents'. Somehow I did not want him to think I was rich or had any kind of money. I am just a poor old in-debt student. Leave me alone. I lied, saying I hit a deer last week and I was trying to focus and pay attention because I didn't want to damage my parents' car. I had hoped he would shut up. He didn't. At some point he was just straight up staring at me and he muttered, poor thing. He then straightened up and pointed to a road sign in panic, saying, I meant the road sign. Poor road sign. Honestly, I think at that point I was thinking if he ever tried anything I would crash this car and both of us into a tree, because if I could not make it out of it, neither would he. I am ashamed to say this, but I didn't want him to get out of this easily. He screamed his name was Archangel Michael. He asked my name. I gave him a fake one. He crouched himself again in panic, going back and forth, saying I shouldn't know his name. I just said okay. To be honest, that was the only thing I would say in the end. When we came into the city where he had to stop, he asked if I could take him to the train station. It was almost 10 p.m., and I knew there were no trains, no lights, and surely no other cars or human presence. I told him we had said he would stop at McDonald's. He nodded. Yes, yes. He said I was nice. Put a coin on the dashboard next to the cigarette. I stopped in the parking lot. Did not park. Just stopped right there in the middle of the way, where I felt it was the most exposed. He just left, saying, see you later. And I drove away very fast. Never saw or heard of him again. I hope you will never take a hitchhiker in. I know I won't ever again. This took place during the late summer of 1993. I was living in Montana but had a boyfriend in British Columbia, and I often traveled between the two places. We were broke and carless, so we hitchhiked when we needed to get somewhere further than biking distance. I had spent the month of August with him in BC, and eventually it was time to go back to school. I, of course, not having worked much all summer, had no money. My bum-ass boyfriend hadn't come through with any money for a bus ticket either. My parents were mad at me, so they weren't giving me any money. All my friends were broke, but we didn't have a phone to call them anyway. We were living in a 2-room cabin with no running water in the mountains. The only phone was a party line that belonged to the neighbors and was basically only for emergencies. The decision was made. I was already 2 days late for school, and I didn't feel like panhandling for a bus ticket. I had to get back, and couldn't wait for the boyfriend's money to materialize. It would be my first time hitchhiking alone. I put my backpack's worth of stuff together, making sure I had my ID, because one time we hitched to the border, left Canada, and tried to get into the US before I realized I had left my ID in Canada, meaning I had no ID to enter the US but also no ID to get back into Canada, but that's a story for another day. Things went surprisingly smoothly for the majority of the trip. An elderly couple picked me up as soon as I got off the mountain and into town and took me all the way to Creston, right near the border crossing. I walked across and was picked up almost immediately by a guy who at first gave me the mild creeps, but all he did was lecture me about how dangerous it was to hitchhike alone and how much I reminded him of his daughter. He took me all the way to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which was damn near half the trip. I was actually having phenomenal luck. I walked to just outside the city limits and stuck my thumb out. 1 hour went by, then 2. You're often walking really slowly when you're trying to catch a ride, and eventually I came across a small flap of cardboard. I picked it up, thinking I could walk off at the next exit, borrow a marker at a gas station, and make a sign. I thought that might help me get a ride. So I'm walking along a little faster now, and suddenly I see something moving in my peripheral vision. I tense, look, and see that it's a 2 feet thin, dark snake trying to get over the cement guardrail to the shoulder. He was never going to make it. He was kind of trying to throw himself over it sideways. I happen to kind of like snakes, and he looked pretty harmless, so I used my sign as a shovel and pitched him over the wall. In hindsight, I should have realized the snake was a bad omen. Before I could reach the next exit, a car slowed to a stop. It's always creepy when a car stops and you're walking up to it, trying to judge if it's Ted Bundy or just an eccentric like you. My heart always sank a little when it would be a single man, but I soon realized he wasn't alone. There was a kid in the front seat who looked to be about 10 to 13. The guy was a little too friendly, but what was he gonna do, murder me in front of the kid? I decided to get in. The man was pretty chatty, introducing the kid as his nephew. He said they were driving back to where they lived in St. Louis from visiting his brother in Seattle so the kid could visit his grandma. The kid hardly said a word. If I remember, and it's been a very long time, it's about 3 hours to where I lived from Coeur d'Alene. He was taking Highway 90 right past the city I lived in, so I was relieved I wouldn't have to get out of the car and thumb it again. The first hour goes by, and it's friendly chit-chat. Lots of family anecdotes and general small talk. The switchblade my boyfriend gave me was cradled in the bottom of my palm the whole time, up my sleeve and out of view, but I began to relax a little. He kept up the friendly chatter, but eventually the questions he was asking took a raunchier turn. Like, did I have a boyfriend? What was he like? What did we like to do? What was our favorite position? What? I silently panicked. My instinct was to play along with his conversation while I tried to figure out what to do. I was pretty sure the drink he had in the console, in a convenience store cup, had more than pop in it, because you could see him physically getting looser as the drive went on. He kept asking gross questions, and I was so embarrassed for his nephew, but still playing along. I just tried to breathe deeply to keep from having an anxiety attack and concentrated on extricating myself from his car. Eventually, he made it clear that he expected me to have sex with him in exchange for the ride. Door-to-door service, he said. Then it got worse. And find one of your girlfriends for my nephew, he said, with this hyper-cheerful and also menacing smile that made my stomach drop. Yeah, I had to get away from this guy ASAP. At this point, we were about 20 minutes from the town I lived in. I was like, sure, and started making stuff up about a phantom hot, slutty friend I had. Then it finally hit me what I could do to get away. I put on my best come-hither smile and said to him, you know what? I bet she's home now. Let's go straight over to her place when we get to town and get this date started. So I had him get off at my exit and asked if we could get some beer first for our date. In Montana, you could buy beer at gas stations, so I had him stop at a place a few blocks from where I lived. When he somewhat reluctantly went inside to buy beer, which I knew was in the back of the store, I opened my door and sprinted down the alley about a block and dove into a huge clump of bushes, folded myself up as tight as I could, and waited. I still had my knife, but now it was out of my sleeve. I was shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard I was afraid it would explode. I tucked my head into my knees and waited, listening for his car to come down the alley. When he got to the gas station, it was about 4 p.m. in September, so there was still plenty of light. I stayed in those damn bushes until night fell, and then I finally sprinted home. His car never came down the alley, but I could hear him yelling for me. He sounded pissed. I got in my front door, locked the deadbolt, and collapsed, dirt and little leaves all over me. My roommate was like, "What happened to you?" I told her the abbreviated version and she said, "Why didn't you call me? I would have picked you up at the border."